All right, everyone. Ready to dive into something big?
Sounds exciting.
It is. We're tackling the Indian Constitution today.
Ah, the cornerstone of Indian democracy.
Exactly. And whether you're prepping for the UPSC or just really into how India works, this deep dive is for you.
Because we're not just skimming the surface here.
Nope. We're going deep, looking at the first 50 years of the Constitution in action.
And luckily, we've got a fantastic guide for this journey.
Oh, tell me more.
The National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution.
That's a mouthful.
I know, right? I
Right.
usually just call it the NCRWC.
NCRWC, got it. But what is it exactly?
Think of it like a thorough health checkup, but for a nation's most important document.
Makes sense, like a 50-year review.
Precisely. Set up in 2000, the goal wasn't to rewrite the Constitution.
More like a tune-up then.
Exactly, to see what worked, what didn't, and offer some recommendations. They had a massive task ahead of them.
I can imagine. So where did they even begin?
They focused on 11 key areas, like electoral reforms, how the economy and society were changing, the balance of power between the central government and the states. Pretty crucial stuff.
Oh, definitely, especially for those UPSC folks out there.
Absolutely.
Okay, so picture this. India in 2000. 50 years after independence, the Constitution's been through a lot. Wars, famines, political upheavals.
It's seen it all. So what did this commission find? What was India's report card looking like?
Yeah, spill the tea.
Well, it was a mixed bag, honestly.
No, how?
On one hand, some undeniable achievements. India had become a stable democracy.
Which is huge, considering its size and diversity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people from all walks of life were participating in the political process. Plus, massive advancements in science, technology, agriculture.
It's easy to forget how far India came in those early decades.
It is. And the report highlights some impressive figures. Agricultural production, especially for wheat and rice, skyrocketed.
Yeah.
Industrial output, electricity generation, all booming. And get this, by 2000, life expectancy in Kerala had actually surpassed Washington, D.C. Mind-blowing.
That is pretty incredible. So things were looking up in many ways. But let's be real, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right?
No, definitely not. And the report doesn't shy away from the challenges.
Like what? Give us the not-so-good news.
Well, the report highlights the stark contrast. India was making strides in development, but making that progress reach everyone, that proved much harder.
So we're talking those persistent issues, poverty, social inequality, even the effectiveness of the government itself. Are the benefits trickling down? Is everyone getting a fair shot?
Precisely those questions, and the report uses some sobering figures to illustrate this. Huge income disparities. A vast number of people still living below the poverty line. Maternal mortality rates, malnutrition, still stubbornly high.
So social policies needed a serious overhaul.
Absolutely. It's like a picture emerging of this nation, grappling with complex problems, even as it achieves amazing things. Makes you think, what did the commission actually recommend to fix all this?
Right. They must have had a ton of suggestions.
Oh, they did. 249 recommendations, to be exact.
249. Wow.
Some requiring actual changes to the Constitution, others focused on laws or how the government operates. A truly ambitious roadmap.
Okay, so 249, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets super relevant, especially for our UPSC folks.
Couldn't agree more.
Because understanding these recommendations, that's key. And the report groups them thematically, right?
Yes, it does.
Perfect. So let's dive into some of those themes, shall we?
Let's do it.
What were some of the big areas they tackled?
Well, one of the most fundamental, strengthening fundamental rights. The Commission wanted to expand existing rights, even introduce new ones, to make the Constitution more relevant to 21st century challenges.
Makes sense. So what kind of changes did they have in mind? We're talking the foundations of Indian democracy here.
Right, big stuff. For example, they proposed a major change to the right to education, free education for all children up to 14, and even up to 18 for girls and kids from disadvantaged communities. And they suggested some bold new rights, too. The right to privacy, for instance, the right to compensation if your life or liberty is taken away illegally, and a guaranteed right to rural employment for a minimum number of days each year.
So a real push to make those fundamental rights stronger and more relevant to people's lives,
Yeah.
like empowering citizens from the ground up.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They looked at the big picture, the political landscape. Because a healthy democracy needs a healthy political system.
Right, so they tackled things like electoral corruption, criminalization of politics, politicians switching parties, the kind of stuff we're still debating today.
Exactly. And they had some interesting solutions. For example, they proposed this thing called a constructive vote of no confidence.
A what?
A constructive vote of no confidence. So instead of just voting a government out, the opposition would also have to propose a new leader.
Oh, interesting.
The idea was to create more stability, make politicians more accountable.
A pretty radical change.
It is. And they didn't stop there. They also suggested limiting the number of ministers in the government.
I can see how that would streamline things and probably save a lot of money, too.
Exactly. So it was about big picture changes and also those nitty-gritty details of how the system actually works.
Makes sense. But what about the people on the ground level? Did the commission address empowering citizens at a local level?
They were all about it. Huge emphasis on decentralization, giving more power to panchayats and municipalities, letting them manage their own affairs.
So shifting power to the grassroots, not just top-down changes.
Exactly. They even envisioned these local bodies having their own sources of funding, their own fiscal domain, giving them real autonomy.
That's a big shift. But I'm curious, did any of this actually happen?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's where we'll pick things up next time.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. All right, listeners, stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive. We'll see which of these big ideas became reality.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be back.
Last time, we went through the first 50 years of the Indian Constitution, all the progress, the challenges, and of course, all those NCRWC recommendations.
A blueprint for change, right?
Yeah.
But did any of it actually happen?
That's the question, isn't it? A report is one thing, but real change is another.
Exactly. So let's see how those 249 recommendations have actually played out over the last couple of decades. I'm sure our UPSC folks are on the edge of their seats for this one.
They should be. It shows how theory turns into practice, or doesn't.
Right, how those recommendations became policy or not. So give it to us straight. What's the verdict?
Honestly, it's a mixed bag. Some recommendations were embraced, others not so much. Some are still being debated even today.
Indian governance in a nutshell, eh? Complex. So let's start with the wins. Where did the report actually lead to real, tangible change?
Okay, take the right to education. Remember, the commission was all about expanding it.
Yeah, making it stronger.
Well, that recommendation led directly to Article 21A. You know, the one guaranteeing free and compulsory education for all kids up to 14.
Oh, wow. Enacted in 2002, right?
That's the one. Millions of kids are getting an education today because of that change.
That's amazing.
And there's more. The Right to Information Act of 2005, landmark legislation, heavily influenced by the Commission's focus on transparency and holding the government accountable.
It's incredible to think those recommendations from way back when are still shaping India today. What about political reforms? Any movement there?
Well, some changes, but it's a mixed bag, as I said. Remember that constructive vote of no confidence idea?
Yeah, pretty radical.
Well, that one hasn't been adopted. Still strong arguments on both sides.
Understandable. Changing how governments are formed is a big deal.
For sure. But some other political reforms did go through. The anti-defection law.
Well, from 85.
Yep, it was strengthened.
Yeah.
Made it much tougher for politicians to just switch parties whenever they feel like it.
Right, to prevent them from jumping ship for personal gain.
Yeah.
But hasn't that also been criticized for stifling dissent within parties? If politicians can't even disagree with their own party, how can there be healthy debate?
Absolutely. It's a tough balance.
Wow.
Preventing opportunism while still allowing for healthy disagreements. This is the kind of stuff that keeps political scientists up at night. No perfect solution.
Always walking a tightrope. Stability versus accountability. So, what about empowering citizens at the local level? Did that decentralization idea go anywhere?
Oh, it did. In fact, it's considered one of the biggest successes of the report. That focus on giving power to local governments led to a major increase in funding for panchayats and municipalities, especially for development projects.
Well, that's great.
They got more autonomy in planning and implementing those projects, too.
So that vision of more localized governance, more in touch with people's daily needs, it actually started to happen.
It did, but not without bumps in the road. There are still issues with building capacity at the local level, making sure funds are used properly, and dealing with the influence of, local power dynamics, which, let's face it, can sometimes undermine the whole point of decentralization.
It's like you're shifting power, but you still have those age-old challenges. Corruption, inequality.
You got it. And that brings us to another big one, the justice system.
Ah, yes. The commission was pretty critical of how inefficient it was. The huge backlog of cases, people struggling to access justice.
They were definitely concerned. So they proposed tons of reforms aimed at streamlining things, making the system more efficient. Remember their suggestion for a national judicial commission?
To handle the appointment of judges.
That's right.
Yeah, that one sparked some serious debate. Taking that power away from the executive branch, big change, people worried about judicial independence.
Big concerns for sure. And the debate is still going strong. Then there was the idea of setting a 90-day time limit on judgments.
For the high courts and Supreme Court, ambitious.
To say the least, that hasn't really happened either.
So, looks like reforming the justice system is a tough nut to crack.
Definitely a long road ahead. What about their recommendations on social and economic issues? Did those get any traction?
Yeah, what about those? The report tackled those big, persistent inequalities, poverty, discrimination.
It did. The commission really pushed for strengthening affirmative action policies like reservations in education and jobs to level the playing field.
Right, but they went beyond just quotas.
Oh, absolutely. They stressed the need for holistic development, better access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities, not just a quick fix, but really lifting these communities up.
Right, it's about creating a system where everyone has a chance to succeed, no matter where they come from.
Exactly. And they were especially concerned about women, boosting their political participation, economic empowerment, safety, all of it.
So forward thinking, for sure. But did these ideas actually translate into real change on the ground?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's where we'll pick things up next time.
We'll tackle that in the final part of our deep dive. Back again for part 3 of our deep dive.
It's the grand finale.
It is. And in the last 2 parts, we've really been digging into the NCRWC report. This amazing snapshot of India in 2000. All the highs, all the lows. We've seen the Commission's big vision for a better India.
More just, more equitable, more efficient.
Exactly. But now the question is, how much of that vision actually became reality?
Ah, the big question. And it really gets to the heart of things, doesn't it? Ideals versus reality, the slow, sometimes messy process of turning ideas into action. And as we've seen, it's rarely simple.
Right. Some things take off, some things stall, and some debates just keep going and going. So let's get specific. We talked about all those big areas the Commission focused on. Strengthening fundamental rights, tackling political corruption, empowering local governments, reforming the justice system, addressing social and economic inequalities. What's the overall picture now? Where have we seen the most progress? Where are we still lagging behind?
Okay, well, one area where the report had a clear and lasting impact fundamental rights, the right to education, Article 21A.
A direct outcome of the Commission's push for education as a fundamental right.
Exactly. Think about it. Millions of kids who might not have gotten an education are now in school, shaping the future of India.
A pretty powerful legacy. And speaking of powerful legacies, the Right to Information Act.
Another big win. Transparency, accountability, holding the government's feet to the fire. It's transformed how we think about good governance.
So in those areas, at least, the Commission's ideas really hit the mark. But what about the political reforms? We talked about some pretty radical ideas like that constructive vote of no confidence. Did any of those come to pass?
That particular one, still being debated, it shows just how tricky political reforms can be.
There are always so many angles to consider.
Exactly. Some people argue it would stabilize things, prevent constant changes in leadership. Others worry about giving the ruling party too much power, stifling dissent. It's a tough one.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot between stability and accountability is a real balancing act.
No doubt about it. But even though that specific recommendation didn't become reality, the report did have an impact. Remember the anti-defection law?
Strengthened to make party hopping more difficult.
Exactly. But as we discussed, that's had its own unintended consequences too.
Definitely a reminder that there's always a trade-off. But what about those decentralization recommendations? Empowering local governments. Did that gain any traction?
It did. It's actually seen as one of the report's biggest success stories. More funding for panchayats and municipalities, more, say, in local development projects. A step towards Gandhi's vision of Gram Swaraj, village self-rule.
That's pretty amazing, giving people real power to shape their own communities.
It is. But of course, there have been challenges.
Oh, I bet. It's not as simple as just handing over power and hoping for the best.
Right. Building up local capacity, making sure funds are used properly, navigating local power dynamics. It's a process.
And those old challenges, corruption, inequality, they don't just disappear.
Exactly. And that brings us to an area where progress has been slower, the justice system.
Oof, yeah. The Commission was pretty blunt about the problems there. Delays, inefficiencies, that mountain of pending cases.
They didn't sugarcoat it. Remember their big idea, the National Judicial Commission to handle judicial appointments?
Yeah, that was controversial.
It still is. Concerns about how it would impact judicial independence. No easy answers there. And in the meantime, that case backlog keeps growing. Some high courts have taken steps, but it's a massive issue.
So much work to do. But what about the social and economic recommendations? Those are about tackling some deeply ingrained problems. Poverty, inequality, discrimination. Did the report move the needle on those at all?
Well, you're right. Those require more than just legal changes. It's about shifting societal attitudes, committing to social justice, and putting resources into programs that empower marginalized communities.
Creating a system where everyone has a fair chance. That's the goal.
Precisely. And while we're not there yet, the report did focus attention on these issues. Strengthening affirmative action policies, empowering women, protecting marginalized communities. It's all part of the ongoing conversation about social justice.
It's like they planted a seed. It may not have fully blossomed yet, but it's still growing, pushing us towards a better future.
I like that, a seed that's still growing. And I think that's the big takeaway from our deep dive into this report. The Indian Constitution, it's not a museum piece. It's alive, it's evolving, and it's up to all of us, engaged citizens, future leaders, to keep shaping it, to make sure our democracy keeps getting stronger.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Knowing what we know now, what changes would you suggest to strengthen the Indian Constitution in the 21st century? What new challenges do we face? What innovative solutions can we come up with to make sure our democracy thrives?
Great questions. And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep participating in the great Indian democratic experiment. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.